Good afternoon. I'm Dirk Roosevelt, professor in the education program here and director of the Master of Arts in Teaching program. And I'm extremely pleased, is that better, to welcome you to this afternoon's talk and to our distinguished guest, Professor Magdalene Lampert. I am going to take just a few minutes to do a little introduction, although just louder. How's that? I will take a few minutes to do a brief introduction. Before I do that, however, I would like Mr. Manuel Tuan, if he is still in earshot. Manuel Tuan is not in earshot, but Manuel, show yourself, please, sir. Many of you know Manuel, others of you do not, but I just need to acknowledge that Manuel is probably the hardest working person that I know, and that is saying quite a bit, as many of the people in this room work ridiculously hard. And Manuel is one of the kindest human beings to ever walk the face of the earth, and this event would not be possible without his hard work and dedication and decency, and I'm very grateful to him. So thank you, Manuel. In the 7 years that we in the Brandeis Master of Arts in Teaching program have been running this small, very intense program for intending elementary and secondary teachers in public and Jewish day schools, we've been host to some exceptional speakers, educators of distinction and significance. I was thrilled a number of years ago to welcome the extraordinary British educator, teacher, scholar Michael Armstrong to our symposium on the pedagogy of the imagination. It was a personal and a professional pleasure of the deepest sort to have Helen Featherstone talk about her important and challenging work in complex instruction. It was an exciting privilege last year to have Cindy Ballinger talk about her remarkable and important work in the area of children's scientific thinking. It's no accident, by the way, that each of the three people whom I have just mentioned is an astonishingly accomplished student of children's ability to get to grasp the world in mind and image, children's extraordinary ability to grasp the world in thought. Each of those persons whom I just mentioned is a deep scholar of that capacity. We're also very proud that Featherstone and Ballinger are MAT faculty. And there have been other speakers and colloquia of note over the years. But the honor and the pleasure of having Magdalene Lampert here today has a character and a quality all of its own. One reason for that, certainly for me, is that Professor Lampert was once my teacher. And as my teacher, as a scholar, and as a friend, she has sharpened, challenged, shaped, deepened, changed how I think about and how I do my work. This work that we are all in this room in one way or another engaged in, the work of teaching. Another reason, speaking slightly less personally, that this is an exceptional and unique honor and pleasure today, is that for some of the people in this room, Lampert has entered directly into their learning and studying of teaching, in that this rather well-used book, Teaching Problems and the Problems of Teaching, is a key text in the studies of some of the students in this room. I think that for the MAT program as a whole, one of the ideas that matters deeply to us, I think it may have been first articulated by my friend and colleague Sharon Feynman-Nemser, is the idea of teaching as practical intellectual work. Another related idea that I will propose is that it's time that we consider that the intelligence and imagination of teachers is fully as precious and fully as necessary as the intelligence and imagination of the children and young people whom the teachers serve. And I would say that Lampert exemplifies these qualities and these values. I think for all of us involved in education, the ambition and generosity of Lampert's understanding of teaching, the spaciousness and elegance of her conception of this work is signal. This work that is at once virtually a human birthright. Is there anyone who does not, as child to a younger child, as adult, as elder, engage in teaching at some point in their life? And yet this work that is also, and at the same time, as a matter of vocation and of profession, as a matter of social need and responsibility, not at all natural, not at all universal, but rather confoundingly complex, persistently difficult to get right in a sustained way, to get right for all learners, as a matter of justice, as a matter of satisfying the right needs and demands of young people. Lampert's conception is large, generous, articulate, eloquent, and elegant of this work of teaching that is, as she says in the title of her talk, hard indeed to do and to learn to do. I'm almost finished. A little bit of biography. You might want to hear some facts. It's all of Roosevelt's judgments, and they're all correct, I promise you, but let me give you a few facts as well. Magdalene Lampert is currently the George Herbert Mead Collegiate Chair in the School of Education at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Over the course of her career, she has taught, and taught like something you've never seen at all levels, elementary, high school, with intending teachers, at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, with practicing teachers, and at the doctoral level. At present, she's coordinator of the Learning, Teaching in, From, and For Practice project, a multi-university undertaking. She also advises the Boston Teacher Residency on its new clinical teacher education initiative. Indeed, although I'm not going to go into it, although she has worked in Michigan for some time, she has a very rich history in New England and in Massachusetts and in the greater Boston and Cambridge area. Actually, of course, I do have to say that that rich history includes teaching at Buckingham Browne and Nichols School, given that there are faculty and administrators of that school present this evening. Magdalene's extensive publication record includes such famous pieces as How Do Teachers Manage to Teach, and the seminal work, Teaching Problems and the Problems of Teaching, that I mentioned a while ago, and which cannot be praised highly enough. She's an extraordinary teacher, someone who powerfully elicits and honors what Dewey long ago referred to as mind activity, the play of mind on mind. She is without equal as a scholar of teaching. She makes visible its complexities and uncertainties. She elucidates its profound challenges, the profound challenges that day-to-day teaching offers to the intellect and to the capacity for judgment, while always doing justice to the fact and the feelings that go with this fact that teaching is at base a deeply human practice rooted in human relationships and shared human quests. Please join me in welcoming Professor Magdalene Lampert.
Thank you, Dirk. It's daunting to think about the fact that I taught Dirk. He's such a grown-up. I'm happy that Dirk acknowledged Buckingham Browne and Nichols, and I particularly would like to acknowledge Bev Malone, who I worked with many years ago, because it was Buckingham Browne and Nichols that had the imagination to think that one could be both a scholar and a classroom teacher at the elementary level. And I began my work there, trying to understand teaching while doing it. So thank you for having the courage to think that someone who had just gotten out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education could actually teach in a classroom. Let's see, how are we going to do this so that I can do my slides? Will this work? I hope I don't break it.
It should work.
Okay. I'm not Lady Gaga. Did any of you see Lady Gaga yesterday?
She was born this way.
She was born with one of these things in her mouth. So we are going to begin by looking at an instance of what I call responsive teaching. We're going to look at a video in which I was teaching 5th grade, and the student who is featured is named Sandra in the book. It's kind of hard to use pseudonyms and real names when you're showing video, but her name in the video is Shannon, so you're going to know that because I'll say it in the video. The lesson that we're going to look at, just to give you a little background, revolved around a material called fraction bars. And these bars are made out of cardboard, and they represent halves, thirds, fourths, sixths, fifths, tenths, and twelfths. And they're a very handy tool for talking about things like which is bigger, if you add this 6/12 to 1/3, what's going to happen. So you can do it all physically with these bars. On the day that we're going to look at, the students, my 5th grade students, had been asked to mix up the bars on the desk. They were working in pairs. Pick out 5 and put them in order. So that was the task that they were working on, thus having to decide which is larger. And then, you probably can't see this, I put a piece of paper up on the wall, and the discussion was going to revolve around locating the fraction bars on a number line. So what this says is locate the numbers associated with each fraction bar on this number line. Work with your partner, write in your notebook why you think what you did makes sense. And then there's a space for 2 names. So Shannon and her partner, Voyo, were working with 2 fraction bars, 5/6 and 5/12. So you see the 6 are arrayed here, all the red ones. You can see 5/6 is the second one from the bottom. And then we have 5/12. 5 pieces out of 12 are colored in. And the issue in the video is whether 5/6 and 5/12 go at the same place on the number line. That is, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces, put 5/6 there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces, put 5/12 there. So we're going to look at that video, and while we do, I'm going to challenge you. You don't have to write things down, but if you have a piece of paper, you could write this down. What do you see that's challenging about the teaching in this video? What's hard about it from any particular perspective you would like to take? And yes, you do get to see what I looked like in 1989. And hopefully we can make this bar will go away once I start it. So the first part of the video is subtitled because it's a lot of Voyo and Shannon talking to each other. The subtitling stops at a certain point when Shannon comes up to the board, and the sound quality is much better, and so I didn't subtitle the whole thing. Okay, so now the sound in the room is not on.
Yes.
Hold the mic to the computer.
Yeah, we tried that. It didn't work.
so
The sound was
well
working
earlier.
much better before. Did that guy leave? Just you got a brilliant phone. Yeah, but it works much better than that just before.
Oh, wait a minute. It's about a 5-minute clip. So at the beginning of the video, I'm asking, in order to put these 5/6 and 5/12 on the number line, someone had suggested that we cut the number line into 12 pieces. And so I asked, what does anyone else think about that?
What does anybody else think about this idea of cutting it into 12s? William and Shannon, did you cut it into 12s? Why? Okay, under 5/12 you put 5/6, so let me see if I can do this. Where would 5/12 go on this drawing, according to your plan, Shannon? Where would 5/12 go? It is hard to explain, that's why you're here, so you can learn how to do it. Okay, can you explain why you put it there? I want everybody to see whether they agree with Shannon on where 5/12 go.
Each one is according to the numbers.
Okay, so why don't I write those in? 0, 12, 1, 12, 2, 12. Okay, let's just stick with the 12s for a while. Why did you pick this one for 5/12? Well, look at Shannon. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this one is really 4/12. And this one would be 5/12. Okay? What do other people think about that? Charles? Okay. Anna, what do you think? Why? The half mark on.
So he says, I agree with 5/12, and then he says to me, and I said, why? And he said, where's the halfway mark on that line?
This line? be on this line. Where would I start looking for it on this?
Going back to 512.
Why?
Because like 512 is closest to the half, and 612 is the last name against the half of the red one. So it would be that one.
What do you mean, 6/12?
Could you hear what he said? So he said 5/12 is right next to 6/12, and 6/12 is the halfway mark.
Is the half of the
6/12
red one?
is half of 6 is half of 4, so we put on the half line, and then 5/12 is closest to 6/12.
Okay. So I don't have, I need to put 3/12 in there. I don't put that one in. Okay, Sudeep?
Well, I think we should say first. I do agree with what 5/12 is. I disagree with Shannon said.
So he says, first, I do agree where 5/12 is.
And 5/12 and 5/6 go together.
And I disagree that 5/12 and 5/6 go together.
Because it couldn't be possible. Because 5/12 has to be 10/12. 5/6 has to be 10/12. 10/12.
So it wouldn't be possible because 5/6 has to be 10/12.
Also has equal amount as 5/6.
Okay, let me just get another color of chalk so I can put these two ideas up here.
And I think that the reason you couldn't be 12 is I think it's the best way because halves, thirds, fourths, and 6 can all be placed in the place where 12 are. 12 mark.
So he's coming back to a question I asked earlier, which started this whole conversation, which is why cut it into 12ths? Why would that be a useful thing to do? So I'm going to stop it there. So, what happened? We're going back to the beginning. Just a few thoughts. Why do you think, what are the challenges of what I'm calling in this example responsive teaching? What would you point to?
Keeping students interested in each other's ideas.
I'm not going to take the time to give you the microphone. If you don't mind, I'm going to say what she said. Keeping students interested in each other's ideas. What else?
For you as the teacher, understanding Sandra's thinking on the spot.
So understanding Sandra's thinking on the spot.
Having the kids are in completely different spots, so having the kids understanding what another kid was saying would be hard.
So the kids being in different spots. You saw 3 different students, Cheryl, Ahmed, and Sudeep, say their thinking. And they might be in 3 different spots. You read the book, I think. So, with my colleagues at the University of Washington and UCLA, who work with me on this project called Learning Teaching in, from, and for practice, we've been calling this ambitious math teaching. And what we mean by ambitious math teaching is math teaching that aims to produce competent performance in complex domains for all students. So in terms of the work we do around learning to teach, those are the basic goals of the learning that we try to keep in mind. So elaborating a bit on that, and you'll begin to see where responsive teaching fits in here. We're looking to have students learn not only to acquire knowledge, but also to understand what it is they're acquiring and to be able to use it. in complex domains, so domains that involve communicating with one another, providing evidence for conclusions, and in which one piece of information is deeply connected to lots of other pieces of information. And you can see, even if mathematics is not your key subject, that this can apply to any subject matter. And finally, for all students, what we understand about making performance in complex domains available to all students means that we have to pay attention to what students bring to a lesson. And we have to continuously calibrate teaching to learning. So that definitely implies that one needs to teach responsively. So you couldn't do competent performance in complex domains as learning goals unless you engage with students responsively and pay attention to how they think about things. So that was sort of what I set myself up to understand when I started to write about my own teaching, focused on the mathematics. And in the book that some of you are familiar with, I talked about various challenges representing mathematical knowledge in use as a connected whole rather than a sequence of topics. So just in that little snippet of the lesson, you could see that there was a lot of content, a lot of different content, some of which would be in one chapter in a book and another chapter, but as a responsive teacher, I need to take what's coming at me and teach to it, teach into it. A second thing is, as one of you said, structuring classroom interaction so that all students will willingly work on problems and intentionally learn from their work. So this example comes from chapter 10 in the book, which is specifically about teaching students to learn from their work and think of themselves as competent. Another key feature of this kind of teaching, which is illustrated in this video, is treating students' mathematical responses to problems as conjectures to be reasoned about. So it's not by chance that Sudeep says, I agree with this part, I disagree with this part, and here is why I disagree. So that's been established as the classroom culture. And finally, on this list, one is choosing instructional materials based on a continuous diagnosis of what the students are giving you. So it's when Sandra Shannon gives me what she's given me to work with that I decide I need to write 0/12, 1/12, 2/12, 3/12 at each space on the number line. That wasn't in my lesson plan. That was what I would call responsive teaching. Note that I was offering Sandra a tool with which she could figure out why 5/6 and 5/12 might not go on the same space. We didn't see her figure that out. What we saw her figure out is a somewhat smaller mathematical issue, which is that students often, when they're counting off on the number line, start with 1. So she pointed to the 0 initially and did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and she put 5/12 on that spot. And then I said, well, can you count it up? And she said 0/12, 1, 2, 3, and she realized that she had put 5/12 where 4/12 belongs. A very common error that I needed to teach into at that moment. So all of these elements of ambitious teaching involve interaction. So structuring classroom interaction, treating students' mathematical responses as conjectures. That's interaction. and choosing instructional moves based on what you can see going on diagnosing what students are doing. So the representation of this kind of work that I think is most basic comes from, for me, from the work of David Hawkins, the instructional triangle. So we have 3 kinds of relationships going on simultaneously. Something to be taught and learned. The teacher and the students are all in relationships. And these relationships are complicated. Social interaction is complicated. Subject matter is complicated, and there are temporal complexities. So I'm going to just run through this quickly because, as I said to you, when you said what you said, that you must have read the book. That instructional triangle is a very simple diagram. In the classroom, there are many students. There's not just one student. And furthermore, the students have relationships with one another. So one thing I'm balancing in the piece of video that you saw is the continuing relationship that Shannon is going to have with Cheryl and Sudeep and Ahmed. So whatever I do with her up front there is going to affect the way she's able to relate to her peers and vice versa. The other piece is the notion that topics don't present themselves one at a time. You have to deal with interrelated intellectual territory. And the temporal complexity, once you get into responsive teaching, which is embedded in relationships, you have these interactions. You might say teaching happens in the moment when I decide to put those numbers next to each one of the 12s. But in fact, that moment is embedded in a whole lesson, and the lesson is embedded in a whole day, and the day is embedded in a unit, which is embedded in a year. So as a classroom teacher, I don't say hello and goodbye to the student in that moment. So whatever I do in that moment is based on what I know about them from the day before and the day before that, and moves into the future in the sense that whatever I do on this day is going to affect what I can do the next day and the next day, intellectually and socially. So balancing all of those complexities is one way of unpacking why this kind of teaching is hard to do. If you hold something constant, like I'm only going to work on X topic, then the relationships that are going on among students are made more simple. If you put the topics in order, then the temporal complexity is reduced. So there's this interaction between these 3 kinds of complexities, which is part of what I would argue makes this kind of teaching hard. So then the question is, okay, if it is this complicated, how do you learn how to do it? How do you learn how to do something that involves keeping a whole set of ideas about fractions in your mind, a whole set of students that you know over time in your mind, and the timing of the lesson, like do this first, and make sure you get it all done before the bell rings, please. Well, here I really am going to turn to the work of my, my research project, because this is exactly what we focus on. And I want to acknowledge that the rest of this talk depends on Megan and Angela and Hala and Elham and Adrian and Nicole and Kate and Heather at these various institutions. We have been working together for the since 2007 to try to develop a teacher education practice focused on ambitious mathematics teaching. And let's see. So in trying to design environments where novices can learn this kind of teaching, we know that we have to work on interaction and improvisational responding, where you do what you do based on what you see and what you hear. Not entirely, and I've thought a lot about the nature of improvisation and written something about that. It's not making it up as you go along. It's pulling from a repertoire of things you know how to do. Another thing that this kind of teaching requires is keeping your goal in mind. It would not do to respond all over the map, because, as one of you said, you've got to keep all of the students in mind. And you've got to put a coherent lesson together that aims toward a mathematical goal and have some sense of how far you've gotten toward that goal by the end of the lesson. And I talked about how you do all these multiple things at once. The issue in making judgments on the spot in a social and intellectual domain let's see, what's the best way to say this? I want to say about 10 things at once here. In order to understand this aspect of my teaching, I did a lot of reading in ethics and began to understand the role of principles. So when I act spontaneously, I am acting on the basis of principles as a teacher. And those principles are treating students like sense makers, keeping your mathematical goals in mind, giving all students access to the lesson. So those are the principles that I have in my mind. And when I deal with a situation where I have to make a judgment, that those are what help me to do what I do. It's not kind of spontaneous, just do whatever comes to you. We need to have sort of ways of judging what good improvisation is. And it's not that everybody is going to do the same thing, but that people should have a set of principles on which they're acting. So, if we could go back and analyze the videotape, you would find many moments where what Sandra was doing was ambiguous. Someone said, you know, you have to be able to understand her thinking. And so I'm giving an interpretation to what she does. So sense-making on the part of the teacher is kind of parallel to sense-making on the part of the student. The simultaneity of dealing with the social issues and the intellectual issues, dealing with all the students at once. And as I wrote in How Do Teachers Manage to Teach, it's not always clear whether you should do this or that, because both of those things, according to your principles, might be good things to do. So we need to manage dilemmas and find solutions that work as best we can for everybody. So one of the tools that we've invented, a pedagogy of teacher education, that we didn't invent it. I won't go into how I learned about it. That's another talk. We do something that we call rehearsal with intervention with novice teachers. And it is designed to get at learning how to do those aspects of teaching that I've just been talking about. The rehearsal occurs in a cycle, and cycles are repeated. This is the learning, teaching in, from, and for practice. Whoops, sorry. So, before the rehearsal, which I'm going to show you a videotape of, the novice teacher would have observed an instructional activity, either live or on video. With a group, he or she would have done some kind of analysis of the math in that teaching and the pedagogy. What is the teacher doing in what you just saw? What are the practices, to use that word in another way? Then, to the extent possible, all of the novices in the group will prepare to teach the same activity. Best case scenario, we have a summer institute in which a group of 25 novices are all teaching math to second graders. So they literally can go in and do the same activity. Alternatively, we try to create activities that are adaptable up and down grade levels, so that by changing the numbers or changing the problem context, you can keep the same structure and still do the activity. So they prepare in pairs to teach that activity that they've watched, that they've analyzed, and they're going to be able to teach to children. After they prepare, they rehearse. And the reason I'm talking about this today is I think it's the most unusual thing in what we do. Probably many of you who do teacher education have your students observe and analyze and prepare. But putting this coached rehearsal in between preparing and the rest of the cycle is deliberately intended to work right inside of practice. There is a company that manufactures a little thing that you can put in teachers' ears when they're teaching children, and they coach them live while they're teaching children. I've never tried it, but and I'm not going to get into whether I think it's a good idea or not. But what we have done is a simulation of the lesson before the enactment with children. When they enact the lesson with children, they record what happens and then bring back records of student work and videos of the lesson, and the group analyzes. So here's what we thought we were going to do, and here's how it turned out. Additionally important is the fact that the teacher educators have records of what actually happened in classrooms. And you may have those as the teacher of a methods course. When I was teaching math methods, I had 25 students in 25 different classrooms teaching 25 different lessons. And for me to not only just simply comprehend 25 different reports on what happened, I really had very little knowledge with which to judge the quality of what happened. So what we're trying to do in this model is to reduce those parts of the complexity that can legitimately be reduced while maintaining the complexity of teaching. So if all of the novices are teaching the same instructional activity, then when I look at what they're doing, I'm able to process it in a way that I wasn't able to process 25 reports on here's what happened when I tried it. Because they're all trying something different. And in this case, that what they're out there trying experimenting with, and I mean that in the Deweyan sense, what they're experimenting with is similar enough that it can be used to build a community of practice. In the debriefing of the lesson, we talk about how should this instructional activity be changed? What would you do differently the next time? Okay, this time you had kids sitting in rows, maybe it would be better if they sat in circles, and so on. So the cycle is repeated at least 3 times so that people can learn from experience. Not just learn from doing, but learn from doing with analysis. So we're going to look at one of these rehearsals that occurred after students saw an activity be demonstrated, after they prepared, and before they went in to teach it to children. Because what we've really been working on is what should a teacher-educator do in that situation. The more common way of working with students is to sit down with them individually and plan a lesson, then watch them teach the lesson, and then debrief afterward. In many teacher education settings, the person who's doing that is not a subject matter knowledgeable person, does not know what happened in the methods course, and they're working on, you know, can you plan, can you carry out the lesson, can you talk about what happened? But by positioning that in the middle of all the rest of these pedagogies, we're trying to bring some shared interpretation, shared values, shared principles to bear on the analysis. So the analysis is not coming from what I think is good, it's coming from, here are our 5 principles. How did you try to enact them in this lesson? How might we enact them better the next time? So in the clip that we're going to watch, I'm stumbling because at the Boston teacher residency they call them residents. At the University of Michigan we call them interns. And I've tried to settle on novices. But whenever I want to say the word, I'm now like stuck. But you know what I mean. Those ones who are learning how to teach. So we have a group of 25 novices for this activity that you're going to see. During this hour, half of them are working on literacy and half of them are working on math. And then they switch, and the ones who worked on literacy work on math and vice versa. The children in the school also do both math and literacy, and they switch. So it works out pretty well. Both math and literacy have 2 teacher educators who plan together, who watch the lessons and talk about and assess the learning of the novice teachers. At rehearsal time, so we have now we have half of the people working on math. They are again divided in half, and one teacher educator works with 6 people and the other teacher educator works with 6 people. So that's what you're going to see. In the rehearsal, the teacher educator and the novice teachers who are not rehearsing take the role of students. So they simulate being a student. That's also not new, but what we're doing in this situation is based on many, many observations of the real students that these novice teachers are going to teach. So it's not like we're just kind of pulling out ways of giving you a hard time. the ways that we're using to give you a hard time is something that we actually saw happen in some classroom. So the teacher educator is the central simulated student, acting like a second grader would act, giving mathematical responses the way a second grader would give mathematical responses. The other novice teachers also are simulated students. And in this case, I won't go into a lot of the background. One simulated student said that 43 plus 30 is 73, and another simulated student said 43 plus 30 is 63, no, 64. So the novice teacher who is rehearsing has to deal with this. And I chose this to parallel the Sandra example because this happens a lot in math classes. And we could think about, what was Allison thinking? Why did she think a second grader would say 43 plus 30 is 63? No, 64.
Is that addressed?
Sure, why not? If you treat Allison as somebody who's doing something that is not totally random, what would you say? Yep. Yes, you with the purple sweater.
That the student is not paying attention to place value and that they're adding digits.
Other hypotheses?
Can you repeat?
Oh, she said the student is not paying attention to place value and they're adding digits. Yep.
She reversed the 3 to the 4 and 43.
Why would it make sense for her to reverse those?
Why would it make sense to think that, or why would she have done that?
Why might she have done that? Do you have an idea?
Because 3 comes before 4.
3 comes before 4, that's one possibility. Other possibilities?
Developmentally, second graders reverse numbers like that all the time.
Other possibilities?
So when you say 43, 3 comes first. And 3 is the last thing that you hear, so maybe remember that first.
So 3 is the last thing that you hear, and it also, the way the problem is written, I did this intentionally, it's, the 2 3s are right next to each other. It's also interesting, and we could spend time analyzing. At first, she said 63, and then no, 64. But we're not going to go there because we don't have time. So Rebecca is working on what do I do with Allison? And we're going to look at a couple of different clips. I chopped it up because the whole thing was too long. And as it stands, we're probably about close to out of time anyway. So I'm going to show you a bit from the beginning, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So the woman in the black shirt is Rebecca. She's a novice teacher. In the Summer Institute, none of these people have ever taught before. So she's like, at this point, 2.5 weeks into her program. They have done the cycle that I talked about every day for 2.5 weeks. That's the other thing that's designed into this environment. Hopefully the sound will still work.
Kind of sequence of addition problems again. There's some far away. Just a reminder, sit like stars. If you want to say something, quiet thought. Today we have to be really mindful of listening to one another. We're going to share strategy.
I'm trying to move that.
Today we've been really mindful of listening to one another. We're going to share strategies and we're going to talk about one another's strategies. We're going to start with...
That tends to be how important. How many groups of 10 side? 4.
So, in my effort to move this bar around so it doesn't get in the way, I know there must be a way of making it go away. Does anybody know what it is?
Just move your mouse off.
If you move the cursor off it, it will
move
fade
your
out.
mouse off the screen completely.
Maybe.
You could also make it full screen by clicking the button in the lower right-hand corner.
That should make it, but we'll see what happens when we do that. We just have to go back a little bit. Full screen, but
did you notice what happened? She reiterated the problem, 43 plus 10, 53. I gave the first answer, but she asked then, yeah. How did you figure out 53? That's an example of not getting stuck on the same student who always gives that answer.
Let's do 43 plus 30. This time I want you to do it on your paper on the open number line. Use that to figure it out. Okay. And when you figured it out, you show it back.
So the woman in the red sweater is Hala Gusseini, my colleague.
Any other answers? Elson, what did you get your answer?
I have 3 root 6 and then 64.
So are you revising your answer?
Yeah.
You're going to make it 64 instead? So you looked at these 2 3s. And you said 3 and 3 is 6. Okay. Let's see. Can I just? Okay. So this one is in
that's a good one.
This is in the ones place, and this is in the tens place.
Or if you want, Rebecca, you can ask, how many groups of 10 are we adding to 43?
Okay. All right. So we have to add that. Okay. How many groups of 10 are we adding to 43?
Under 3. What is here?
So 30 is. And now how many? And so basically, I can just kind of go on. We're not going to really do.
So far so good. Rebecca's asking questions. She said, "Why do you think that?" But these are all routines that we've been working on for the last. Why do you think that? What do you think about what she said? Oh, you want to revise your answer. So these are sort of the analyses that kind of came out of looking at not only my own teaching, but other classrooms in which this kind of work goes on. We've sort of picked out some routines. And Rebecca has done some very hard things. She put the wrong answer up on the board. This is a very difficult thing for a beginning teacher to do. And she calmly allowed Allison, to revise her thinking. And that language, revising your thinking, why do you think that, is all common to the set of novices that we work with. So you can't see the people sitting in the class who are with their backs to the thing, but they all are going to take turns rehearsing the same activity over the course of the week. Now, and you see Hala stopped and said, why don't you try that? Did you notice she said, that's a good one, right? So she knows now, just like the teacher identifying, like, I wanted to work with Shannon. I wanted to spend time on Shannon's mistake in my 5th grade classroom because I knew everybody would learn from what she was working on. In this case, the teacher educator is saying, that's a good one. You know, that Allison gave that answer. We're now going to dig into that. So the novice teacher kind of went along and, you know, she's doing okay. But now, she said, so now what am I supposed to do, basically? I can't just go on, right? We're not going to really deal with her strategy. We're going to come back to her. So she's like, now is the moment when responsive teaching has to happen. What are we going to do?
Give up your strategy when we come back to her.
Yeah, and actually if you had asked, who said 73, June, if you had asked June how she figured it out, you could come back to Allison and you could use June, ask June and let's see how we're going to work it out to support Allison.
Okay.
Okay, so she says, you could do this, you could do this, but then she says, now do it and see what happens. So it's the enactment in the moment of the rehearsal. The physical feel. What does it feel like to go back to June?
Because with Allison, I did say, okay, I'm understanding what you did. Let's move on to someone else's.
Because there's a way you can work with Allison to understand, even like have her see that what she did needs revision by this decomposition that you did. That's going in the right direction to really.
So the decomposition on the board is related to what someone said over here. She wrote 43 and she put 40 and 3. And so that the place value is highlighted by that. That's what she means by the decomposition.
Show her what we did. Why don't you go to June and we see what.
Okay, June, how did you figure it out?
43, maybe audio, and then we jump. So 43.
Over here, and then everyone to you did this jump, and then to 63, and then to Sai, how did she get from 53 to 63? She jumped last time. Okay. And Danielle, how did she get from 63 to 73? She jumped. Hey, why do you think she jumped these 3 tens? I'm good. Well, how does it like out? There are 3 groups of 10 and 3. So she said there's 1 group of 10, 2 groups of 10.
Very nice. If A is quiet and doesn't even get that, you can go back and say, how many groups of 10 did we add? 3 groups of 10. And now let's go back to Allison.
Allison. Do you get it now?
That is precious. I mean, that captures why this kind of teaching is hard to learn. She did all the right stuff. She called on this student, she put the number line up, she, had students explain each other's thinking. So, okay, Allison, you must get it now. So, because I don't know what else to do. I did all the stuff they told me to do. So, we could go on, but it's time to stop. That's the punchline.
That's the punchline.
The denouement. Explore her strategy or something like that. That's what she was thinking. Like, maybe this is something I should take up with Allison privately. So we've talked with the novices about that that's a decision you have to make. And when Hala, her teacher educator, said, no, that's a good one, let's go there. That is worth everybody's time. She was reflecting this notion, the developmental notion that second graders do turn the numbers around, that they don't have a fixed, clear sense that this stands for tens and this stands for ones, so why can't we turn them? We can't turn them around. So what we try to do to answer your question is say, if the novice teacher would say, well, I don't know whether to pursue this or not, what's your mathematical goal? The goal of this lesson is for students to articulate place value in tens and ones, and to be able to talk about the jumps on the number line. I didn't give that background, is about sort of jumping by tens instead of jumping by ones when you want to add something. So it was a deliberate choice on the part of the teacher-educator to tell Rebecca, let's dig into this. Does that help?
It does, but can I push you a little bit? I was actually asking you.
Oh.
How did you, in your practice, know? And I understand if you don't want to go there.
What to stop on in a rehearsal?
When you had your own classroom, when did you open it up? For example, Shonda, when did you say, you know what, this is worth, everyone's going to learn something? Because there are countless moments like that versus like when we'll learn something.
So I think...
I hear you asking, what are kind of your criteria for how you decide whether to, as a teacher, what are your criteria for how you decide? Is that what you're asking?
So as a 5th grade math teacher, how do I decide to stop on something and make it worthy of everyone's attention? So not giving you a reading assignment, but one reason why I decided to stop on this with Sandra was the mathematics of it. It is a key idea in understanding fractions that the number of pieces is not what you look at in order to compare two fractions. You have to look at the number of pieces in relation to how many pieces the whole is divided up into. So if it's divided into 12 pieces, the pieces are going to be smaller. That's like what I was working on. But I was also working on Sandra's self-image as a person who doesn't like to do math. The fact that she volunteered to come up to the board was earth-shattering to me as a teacher. And so I decided to give her the spotlight for a pretty good long time. And I tried to work other kids into the conversation, but it was very important to me that Sandra should come up there and feel like she could do this in front of everybody else. So those are two considerations. I certainly, you saw me looking at my watch at one point. That's another consideration. Is that what you meant by criteria?
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
I have a certain feeling that in some way it is putting the cart before the horses, in the sense that the main burden of the novice teacher in many ways is struggling with his own subject matter, and he has to be free of this awareness of the importance of the subject matter to start being responsive. In a sense, I'm thinking whether there is a kind of developmental hierarchy in the learning of teaching here, whether or not being responsive is something you may start doing when you're the second year you're teaching the same curriculum or something like that, since you have to be flexible enough in your understanding of the curriculum.
What do other people think?
Could I just not say what I think, but just draw attention to the fact that there are plenty of people in this room who are at various points in the process of learning to teach who might want to speak to that from within their own experience.
So the assertion was that, or hypothesis was that it might developmentally be more appropriate to develop a novice teacher's flexibility with the subject matter and then begin working on moves and judgment within the context of responsive teaching.
So my first kind of instinct is absolutely understanding that, and I think there is a vulnerability that you're kind of teasing out that can occur when you are required to be immediately flexible content-wise when you're not necessarily comfortable with it. I think the challenge, though, is that it takes the relational part and puts it into the second year of teaching, which is what we often do. When you're required to be flexible, it means that you must see the student in front of you as a person and nurture that relationship, that space between two human beings, between the teacher and the student. And so often we concentrate on forming content and our comfort with content first. And only as an afterthought do we talk about what it means to be in relationship in learning with students. And I think what this does is say, first see the student and the relationship. In some ways, I think content follows more easily, but to get that pattern of relationship first, it seeps down in what you do in a way that I think is really different.
Yes.
Well, I think that makes sense, but also what I hear, what I see is you're taking novice teachers and telling them from the first day, that kid is making sense. And that's crucial. You can't wait for that. It's going to be hard because you're not going to see that sense because it's not your sense, but they are making sense. I don't see how you can wait.
And to me, it's very interesting. I'm a teacher, and one of the discussions we're having in my school is, okay, how do we get so that the kids talk more? And I say, well, but we cannot say talk more without the content. So here we're talking about everything. And I think that these novice teachers are really learning content and how to manage that content simultaneously. And I feel that's very powerful. It's not one step and then another. And I can see that there are like habits of work that develop in a very different way if they are doing this.
Other comments or thoughts on this? Yeah?
You said in your title that it's hard to do and hard to learn. And I think it is hard to do three things simultaneously, but if you don't set the routines in the beginning, then you have 3 years that you have to do each of those. So it's hard, but I think you set down your routines.
So there are several reasonings behind treating these two things simultaneously, in my mind. One is that I read a lot of research in medical education, which suggested that novice doctors were unable to use the equivalent of their subject matter knowledge when they confronted problems of diagnosis. Things that they knew cold, they could not use in interaction with patients. And so the people who were doing this research sort of were at the front end of inventing problem-based instruction, saying, put people in a problem situation, look at what knowledge they need to address that problem, all the different kinds of knowledge mixed up together in the situation. So over the last 30 years, I think cognitive psychologists have come to see that these pieces influence one another, and the situation that you're in when you try to use your knowledge also influences what your knowledge is. So that's one thing that affects me. Another thing that affects me is lots and lots of instances where I've seen novice teachers learn mathematics from interacting with children. I'll just give you one example. Counting by tens, starting at 9. I won't do the whole thing, but you get up to 89, 99, 10, 9, and 11, 9, 12, 9, 13, 9. So the novice teacher is there like, wait a minute, that's wrong. And points to 139 and says, how many tens are in 139? And the child says 13, which happens to be right. And the novice teacher came back to us and she said, oh my God, I can't believe that child couldn't distinguish between the tens and the hundreds. I said, well, you know, let's think about this. Let's use Dean's blocks. Let's, you know, do the math. So that is a situation in which there is some incentive to learn about place value. When I've been in situations where we teach the math first, the novice teachers are like, no kid is ever going to make that mistake. So, you know, why do I have to, this sounds really boring, and I mean, so there's this cyclic kind of thing where, yes, indeed, we do give a lot of attention to content in this situation, but it's content in the context of solving pedagogical problems. There was a third reason, but I can't think of it now. Jay.
Well, this is just an observation following exactly on that, which is that learning quickly on your feet to assume that the kids are making sense also makes teaching math, which can be rather boring, much more interesting. Because you're always finding new ways of looking at the problem that you think is cut and dried with your adult knowledge. But you realize that the kids have all these different paths of understanding, which if you follow it and you get interested in it, actually makes you much more interested in the children. So it's, in that way, I mean, I think that was starting to be evident with that student. I mean, I don't know if she ever before was that interested in children's thinking, but there she was.
So I think someone said that this notion that children are sense makers is something that you learn on the spot when you see them trying to make sense of things.
And it's more fun.
It's more fun, but it doesn't come naturally. It's very difficult to build bridges back to the place where you didn't understand that the number in the tens place was worth 30 and not 3. And so that kind of, the kind of puzzling that we did here together about why would a child add the 3 in the ones place to the 3 in the tens place is something about building values, building a learning community that values children as sense makers. And when a whole group of your peers sit around and say, oh, maybe he was thinking this, or maybe he was thinking that, all of a sudden you think, oh gosh, it's not as simple as I thought it was. So it is because they all are working on solving this problem of working with kids who don't quite yet appreciate place value, they're like trying to figure it out when they make mistakes.
Yes? So I was curious,
do you have tasks for the other children who are involved when they're exploring a specific child's thought process or wonderings about the math that's happening? Because it seems like every video that I've seen so far, there's always a large but very well-disciplined class who's totally quiet and only called on and then off all the time. Is that realistic?
This is one reason why I subjected myself to being videotaped every single day from the first day to the last day of school. And I'd be happy to show you some where the children are not sitting still and being quiet. The way that I organized my classroom was that a problem would be up on the board when the students came in the room from recess, and we established the routine that they would work on that problem individually in their notebooks while I walked around. At a certain point, I would decide to switch from individual work to small group work and have them talk at their tables about what they had done thus far. I would walk around, see what they were doing, who I might call up to the board, and for what reason. I call it teaching while students work independently. At that time, I have some leeway to interact with individuals in the way that you talked about, and hopefully I would have created a task that Sudeep, the boy who spoke last in the video that you saw, can work on as well and deeply as Shannon. So part of the answer to your question is the task, is creating a task that students can work on at a lot of different levels. When the whole group comes together, the assumption is that everyone can learn from listening to everyone else, and you are subject to being called on cold to say what you think about what someone else thought. That's what we're working on here, working on reasoning, communication, listening, and understanding what somebody else is thinking. So at that moment, the students in the class who are more proficient have the job of understanding the students who are less proficient. And explaining why, I mean, it's as important for them to treat one another as sense makers as it is for me to treat them as sense makers. So I don't want to have Sudeep saying, I think Shannon's really dumb because she put that 5, 6, and 5 12s there, you know. But that's the natural thing for 5th graders to do. So they have to learn a discourse that says, I agree with this part, I don't agree with that part, and here's why I don't agree. That's hard work. Not everybody in my 5th grade class could do it. So that's a complicated answer to your question.
I have a question. Do you think that that sort of the student, even whenever students get things wrong, like problems or whatever, do you think that in a certain way that the way they're thinking about it is actually more important than the answer they're coming up with? I mean, I kind of think, in my mind, it kind of almost seems like it is. Like, how they're coming up with the answer that they're getting almost seems more important than whether or not they're getting the right answer, because then you can look and see how they're making sense of it, and you can kind of like analyze their thinking and then sort of teach to that.
Other thoughts about that idea?
I think it depends on what you're trying to teach. I teach chemistry, and if you're teaching chemistry, the answer really isn't important. It's really the process of what formula they use and how they plugged it in, and at the end, they can make sense of that using the chemistry concepts that I taught them, and they did the math correctly, but they got the wrong answer, or they messed up addition. That's not the point, but if the point is to try to get them to do addition and get the right answer, then I feel like it might be a little bit more important.
So how would you reason about this question in relation to the 43 plus 30 is 63 or 64? how would you sort of speculate about what should happen next, or what the goal of, what that student needs to learn?
Well, I think that goes hand in hand with the question from before. Do you need to know the, like, does a novice teacher need to know the content or like the child's thinking? And in order for that child to understand the computation and how that is going to work, they have to go through that process of getting the wrong answer and being able to explain how they got that wrong answer. So, and then having that discussion and hearing other people how they came to their answer to be able to understand what that computation actually means. And it just reminded me of what you said in your book, how you talk about kids can only use black markers. I think that's a very powerful thing to do with kids, is your thinking is important and how you got there is important. And yes, if you get the answer wrong, we'll work on it, but the thought process is more important than getting the right answer all the time.
So just quickly, I would say in the case of the simulated student that Allison was playing, what's important is that that student eventually figures out and learns that if the number is in the tens place, it's 30, and 30 plus 43 is a different matter than 3 plus 43. So there is something wrong with her thinking. What's wrong is the idea that you can treat numbers, treat digits as if they all have equal value no matter where they are in the number. And what we need to work on is that. And I would assert that if we work on that, the next time she encounters 43 plus 30, she won't make the same mistake. Yes?
You said when they come in from recess, you put a question on the board so that all kids at all levels can answer it. But I was just wondering, with the differentiation of it, if it's the same problem, how do you make it for those kids that need the extra challenge, like they really understand this concept, how do you make it so it can be tweaked so it's a little harder for them, but also without making it obvious to everyone in the classroom that some kids might be getting a little bit of a challenge?
So this may change someday. I'm still waiting for the effect of the math reforms. I'd like to point out that this lesson was taught before the NCTM standards came out. And that was 1989. It's now 99. It's 2011. And I'm not seeing a lot of effects of the math reforms. So when I work with novice teachers now, I'm kind of saying some of the same stuff that I did when I taught 5th graders. And that is a preface to my answer to your question, which is that those, I particularly experienced your challenge around a boy who came into my room in the middle of the year who came from a gifted and talented program. And we didn't have a gifted and talented program in our school. And so he was put in my 5th grade along with all the other 10-year-olds in the school, including one who was labeled way at the other end of the spectrum. He did not know how to explain his thinking. He did not know why he did what he was doing. He had learned to do mathematics mechanically and never talked about it. He was very angry with me for about 2 months because he thought, oh my God, you know, I'm sitting here with all these dumb kids and I used to be in a gifted and talented program, and what do you mean I have to explain my thinking? That's a waste of time. I should be moving on to pre-calc by now. Well, we interviewed these fifth graders a year out. They had gone into middle school. And we asked them, so, you know, what are you doing in sixth grade? And what do you, I mean, it was a very structured interview, but basically, what do you remember from last year and what use is it to you? He was amazing. And I have this on tape. Talking about how important it was for me to push him to explain his thinking. And that was the first time he had ever really been challenged in math. It had, up until that point, it had been easy for him, and I made it hard. And he really appreciated it. So the reason I preface that about the math reforms is, if I had only kids in my fifth grade who had been explaining their thinking since first grade or kindergarten, that wouldn't be like the answer to your question. I'd have to come up with a different answer. But I haven't yet seen a classroom in which learning to explain your thinking wasn't relevant to kids at all different levels. And I think it's particularly hard for those students who've never had to do it before.
I have a question about the cycle, how it continues, because it seems that there were different opportunities to go back to the lesson, and I wonder if we have time for you to say a little bit more about that.
So just quickly, in the second grade scenario, and not everybody I work with has the luxury to do it that way, but we did an instructional activity called choral counting. And the first day, it's starting at 4 and count by tens. Stop at 94. The next day, it's start at 7, counting by tens, and stop at 127. The third day, it's start at 9 and count by tens, and stop at 350. So every single day for 3 days, the structure of the activity is the same. First you do a choral count, the teacher writes it up on the board in a particular way, and then you say to the students, do you see any patterns? And you get out the patterns that lend themselves to teaching your instructional goal. And then you say, well, why do you think those patterns work? So the structure of the activity day after day is the same. And here I do think we work developmentally. The first time you do this activity, you just want to get the count out. You want to make sure everybody's with you. And maybe get 1 or 2 patterns out. By the third day, you want to be doing this move that we call orienting students to one another's thinking. You know, why do you think he said that? Do you agree or disagree? So we sort of build complexity into the instructional activity as we repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And believe me, the first time these novices do it, the hardest thing for them is writing on the board, because they have to learn to write over their shoulder, right? So, and you can't do the activity unless the numbers are lined up so that you can see the patterns across the columns and rows. So the physical activity of practicing that over and over again. I mean, say, you know, go home and practice it, because you have to be able to do that as a teacher. So, is that something? I mean, it's a lot more complicated.
But I'm very curious about all these sequences.
Yeah. I'll just say that my colleagues at UCLA and the University of Washington and people who used to be with me at the University of Michigan who are now in Wisconsin are analyzing videos of these rehearsals to try to figure out how to explain what we do and why we do it. So we sort of invented the practice first, sort of as I did in my 5th grade classroom, and now we're trying to analyze it and write about it. So hopefully we'll have some more things that you can read. And we do have a website, actually. Well, it went away. Learning, teaching, if you put learning, teaching, practice in Google, you'll come up to the website of our project, and there are a bunch of papers there, if you're interested.
So I think that we should say thank you. And
Thank
there's some
you.
simple snacks and now a few minutes of mingling and chatting. So thank you so much.
That those of you who are in the program here have been well taught, because your questions were very sophisticated.
We have wonderful students.